himself. Dr. Peter Everts is very much a friend of olive trees. He is a wonderful man, certainly, also a really wise clinician and practitioner. He's been practicing in psychology for over 40 years and has been assisting cross-cultural workers, specifically in member care and mental health, for over 10 years. He is a fount of wisdom and experience, and I think we will receive a lot of good things from him tonight. He told us earlier today that he has way more than he can share with us in an hour. So I know that he's done a lot of work to get ready for this and make sure that what he's bringing to us about shame on this really important topic will be interesting and relevant to all of us. So without further ado, Peter, will you take it away?
Thank you, Lisa. I feel very privileged right now to address you, and I really am touched. I'm aware of how much I need grace, and I hope we all are aware of this gracious flow that comes to all of us. So I want to introduce you as Peter, a recovering perfectionist. I'm going to be talking about shame, a subject with which I am well acquainted with. I've struggled with it all my life, and still can have a grip on me. I would like to tell you that I've done all my homework. I've mastered the content. Excuse me. I've mastered the content and will do I will have done justice to the subject, but that's not the case. I'm still in the middle of this topic. It's a topic that's much bigger than I ever imagined it would be. So I'm feeling a bit vulnerable right now, but that might be the best place to start when talking about shame and grace. And before I begin presenting, I would like to suggest that you don't worry about note-taking. It won't be necessary. I will have OTCC forward you my written text, the presentation that I'm giving right now. I will forward that to you. And you already have the PowerPoint slide. So if you want to take notes, just do it for yourself, but you don't have to do it for what you hear from me today. I want to move to the next slide, if you would. As you read this, you will see the goals for this webinar, but really there's only one, and I want everyone by the end of this talk to find at least one practice or one exercise that I have encouraged you to try so that you can experience the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ in your walk and in your life, that the shame that may bind you and have any control over you will be lifted, and you will experience a lightness that you haven't before. Well, first, we need to get a bit of humor before we get too deep into the shame stuff. It's already a cone of shame. Do you need to turn it into a cone of utter humiliation? Next. You'll fit in perfectly. Our corporate culture is entirely shame-based. Thank you for not mentioning me by name, preacher. Is there a little bit of shame relief here, do you think? It's a good thing you called us when you did, Mrs. McPhee. Your basement was nearly hip deep in toxic shame. That's not a bad way of getting toxic shame disposal, 24-hour service. So Charlie Brown's posture says it all. His eyes look away, his shoulders slump. He looks like he's about to shut down and go somewhere to hide. Shame is embodied. We experience it right there in our souls and body. Next. Shame erodes our soul. It leaves us feeling there is something wrong, something lacking, or inadequate about us. We're not worthy of love and belonging and connection. When shame is allowed to fester and grow, it can consume us. Next. Go ahead, next. Shame is not like guilt. Guilt points to behavior and says, I did something wrong. And shame points to the self and says, I am wrong. Guilt leads to pro-social action. It moves forward with acknowledgement and repair. Shame triggers a fight, flight, freeze response in us and it disconnects us from ourselves, others, and God. You notice how shame triggers us? We want to absolutely avoid feeling it. So we can withdraw and isolate, hide from the sources of shame, or avoid feeling shame by engaging addictive behaviors. We can also act angrily towards others. We can blame others, or we can turn that anger towards ourselves. Do you see how shame can be so well disguised? The workaholic, the codependent, the perfectionist like myself, the bully, all can share shame at their core. We'll do anything to avoid feeling it. And sometimes we experience guilt and shame at the same time. It can be a challenge to sort out one from the other. For example, when I do something wrong, I experience guilt and I can take appropriate action. And I should feel emotional relief. But if I continue to beat myself up for it and persist in feeling guilty, I really have entered shame, have I not? Next slide, please. Is there a sense of healthy shame? Most researchers say yes. Healthy shame helps build social boundaries. It gives a sense of propriety. It's a kind of humility. My friend and colleague, Tom Wilkinson, reminds that healthy shame is what helps keep our clothes on when we go out the door. Perhaps healthy shame works more like guilt. Both can lead to constructive action. A social miscue that leads to embarrassment can spur someone to apologize, even if he or she is not guilty of anything. Next. Mostly shame is harmful to us. It shows up in traumatic disorders. It shows up in all forms of abuse, emotional and behavioral problems, and it underlies addictive patterns. It undermines our intimate connections in marriage, family, communities, and it distorts our very identity, how we see ourselves, others, and God. Next slide. What are some of the key facts that we can learn about shame through the recent research on brain functioning? Well, we know that the experience of shame comes early, probably around 15 months of age. And it occurs well before language is mastered, well before guilt is formed, which can take place more towards when a child reaches the age of 5. Guilt requires development of conscience and empathy, which are later developments. Shame neurons are hardwired and less adaptive to change than other neurons. And shame is greatly disruptive to our thinking, our emotions, and our behavior. There's some good news. The brain is adaptive and can rewire. We can learn new patterns of reacting and behaving. Next. I wonder what are some of these, what are the implications from brain research? I've listed a number of my questions here for you to look at and think about. I'm especially caught by these questions. If the initial experience of shame in all of us is pre-verbal, it happens before we speak and have language to mediate it, it's highly disruptive. It helps us, it actually forces us to shut down. It's hardwired and not easily remediated. How can we lessen shame's power while training and educating young children? In other words, is there some way to prevent shame from taking its hold so dramatically when we are raising our children? Another area is once shame is embedded in us, it's deeply rooted. It's not easily accessed by language. So, how does that influence how we counsel or engage healing practices? For example, sermons and verbal counsel and so on. Are those deep enough to heal the shame that binds us? Next slide. What, what do we heal? How do we heal from shame? Let's start with the contributions made by a couple of researchers over the last 20 years, Brene Brown and Kristen Neff. Brene Brown is a social science researcher well known for her work with shame. If you've not read any of her books or listened to one of her TED Talks or podcasts, I strongly encourage you to do so. For those who struggle with self-acceptance, a good starting point would be to read her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, and then follow it up with a deeper look at shame and the role of vulnerability in the next book she writes called Daring Greatly. In The Gifts of Imperfection, Brown challenges us to live wholeheartedly. As we embrace our imperfections, we have the courage to let go of what other people think about us. We build compassion by establishing healthy boundaries for ourselves. And we connect more intimately with others when we come ourselves to self-acceptance. Next. In Daring Greatly, Brown concludes that when we vulnerably tell our story to someone who offers us empathy and understanding, shame cannot survive. To build shame resilience, we need to be able to recognize when shame comes up in our bodies, to feel our way through it, to learn what messages and expectations have triggered it. The next step in shame resilience is to do a reality check on these messages. Are they realistic, attainable, what we want or what others want for us or from us? Then we need to share our story with someone who can empathize with us. When we share our story, we are, in Brene Brown's words, speaking shame, talking about how we feel and asking for what we need when we feel shame. These steps are fluid and don't necessarily happen in order. Next slide, please. Brown concludes that being vulnerable is a hallmark of shame-resilient people, the willingness to be seen and the willingness to be known. In Daring Greatly, she skillfully writes about the ways we defend against being vulnerable by wearing vulnerability armor. It's kind of my view of her way of talking about our defenses. It's a good read, and I commend that book to you. Next slide, please. So what are the research findings on self-compassion, especially the work by Kristen Neff and her colleague, Chris Germer? The goal of self-compassion is not to increase self-esteem, but self-acceptance. It's not about feeling better about ourselves. It's about accepting really who we are and all the good, bad, and ugly. Next slide, please. What does self-compassion look like? It means that we are kind to ourselves when we fail or struggle in particular. We do not isolate, but connect to others. And we practice staying in the moment, non-judgmentally, accepting what is. This last concept of being non-judgmental to ourselves is what is so difficult for many of us to put into practice. When I let my perfectionism take over, I experience in me an inner critic reviewing everything I say or do or think. I worry about the future. I beat myself up over the past. My body's cortisol levels start to climb. And if I practice self-compassion, I stop and observe what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking. I stay curious about my experience, not condemning myself for any of the negative messages that are coming up within me. As I stay non-judgmental, I let my body and my emotions relax. I become better at letting go of shame's lies. For those of you who want a Christian perspective on mindfulness, I recommend the books by Odin and Krager, and you can find them in the resources. Next slide, please. Neff uncovers the erosive impact of self-criticism on self-compassion. She challenges the myth that self-criticism is the way to do more or perform better. Oftentimes in the short term, we can kick ourselves into gear, as it were, to get that project done or to do it better. In the long run, that form of self-criticism has some consequences. And Neff notes that self-criticism is a literal attack on ourselves. Next slide, please. So you have listened to a lot of information right now about shame, shame resilience, and self-compassion. You can see some of the questions that have come up for me as I've worked through some of what I've talked about today. But what are your questions or observations at this point in the webinar? What I'd like you to do is take about a 5-minute break right now and reflect on what your initial reactions are to what you've heard or what you've read. Just write them out for yourself. And once the chat function is open later at the end of our time together, you may still want to send that question or make that observation through the chat. But for right now, just take a short break and we will be back at Ontario time at 7:30 p.m., just a few minutes from now. Thanks. Could you run and just get water from me, thanks? Okay. You don't have to heat it. You ready, baby? We'll circle back here in about a half a minute. So can I have the next slide up, please? There we go. So I welcome you back from this brief break. I plan to go another 15 minutes of talking with you, and then we'll take a little bit longer break in which I'll instruct you then about how I would like you to use that time. It's my intention that I finish my talk about 5 to 10 minutes after 8 o'clock Ontario time, and then open it up for Q&A. So let's deepen our understanding of how shame and grace are absolutely central to our spiritual life. Next slide, please. Gerald May, a Christian psychiatrist, wrote a classic book called Addiction and Grace back in 1988. He makes clear that we all desire to be loved and accepted, but we are afraid to be vulnerable. We protect ourselves from the potential of rejection by engaging in a variety of attachments or idols or addictive behaviors, which take us further away from the love and acceptance we desperately seek. We will come back to him when we talk about grace. Next slide, please. Kurt Thompson is a Christian psychiatrist who applies his understanding of the neurobiology of shame to the scriptural narrative. In the Garden of Eden, following the temptation by the serpent, Adam and Eve immediately experience shame, cover themselves, and hide even as God gently seeks them out. Notice that disobedience occurs, but the immediate experience is shame. And that shame begins to happen immediately between Adam and Eve. God is not put off by their shame and actually seeks them out. So in creating us, God makes himself vulnerable to us by risking our rejection. In turn, God invites us to become vulnerable to him and each other to restore our connection. Thompson interprets Good Friday in the most intimate way, and I want to quote him here under point 3 of this slide. He says, Good Friday is God coming to find us, saying that there is no place in your shame that I am not present and already there waiting for you. And I am going to wait for you until you open your eyes to me being with you in that space, and let resurrection take us both home. Next slide, please. Simon Cousins, who spent time as a worker in an honor and shame culture, wrote recently, just 2 years ago, a book called Looking Shame in the Eye. And he brings theology, psychology, and cultural anthropology to the intersection of shame and grace. He says, Jesus took on shame not only on the cross, but it was at the very heart of his ministry and teaching. Well, I don't think Jesus tried to shame the leaders of his day when he confronted their role in the shame-based religious system that they had created. He did indeed provoke their shame, and it became shame blame, which ultimately led to his arrest and death. But when Jesus engaged those who were shamed, he put himself at risk, became vulnerable, saw through their shame, honored the worth of the individuals, and freed them to no longer be in bondage to their shame. Notice Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, how they both take risks with each other. Jesus, being a male Jew, coming in the middle of the day and addressing alone a Samaritan woman, a risky move in and of itself. And then as Jesus makes the Samaritan woman feel safe, he acknowledges her shame. She feels its release and tells her friends and neighbors about this man, Jesus. Or how about the Lucan account of the prostitute who risks social shame in Simon's house, a Pharisee, where Jesus turns shame on its head and pronounces that the prostitute not only has honored him over and above what his host has failed to do, but that her shame redeemed allows her to love more deeply than those who don't think they need shame redemption. Cousins goes on to talk about the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount really being about elevating those who are ashamed, blessed are those who are meek, and so on. There's so much more to be said here, but we need to move on. I'd like this slide to go up very quickly. And for the sake of time, I want to leave you to ponder Clapp's brief but penetrating analysis of shame and his challenge to us. I'll leave that for you to explore on your own. But let's go to the next slide. Lewis Smedes, a former professor of Christian ethics at Fuller Seminary, wrote a classic book called Shame and Grace back in 1993. It's simply written and profound, and it's still relevant today. I really appreciate Smedes breaking down grace into 4 dimensions. The first being that it is there to pardon our guilt. And the second is to overcome our shame. The third is to empower us in the likeness of grace, moving from the heaviness of shame he describes to the lightness of grace. And then grace deepens our gratitude and our joy. Next slide. Are we worthy of grace? The answer is yes. We don't deserve grace. It's a gift and unmerited, but we are worthy of it. Grace accepts us for who we are right now. God does not ignore our fallenness, but he also does not diminish our inherent worth. We are image bearers, inherently worthy, but shame has eroded our self-worth, and grace provides a way to restore it. Next slide, please. Does grace lead us to self-forgiveness, self-acceptance, or both? I think Smedes makes it clear when he says, quote, when we forgive ourselves, we heal our guilt. When we accept ourselves, we heal our shame. Forgiving ourselves is the spade work we do on the way to accepting ourselves. When I hear someone say to me, you know, I know that God forgives me, but I cannot forgive myself, I wonder how much grace he or she has received. I suspect that the guilt is gone, but shame and lack of self-acceptance continues to have full sway. Smedes makes it clear that shame leads fully to that acceptance that we have in God's love for us. Okay, next slide, please. Gerald May, back to him, Addiction and Grace, views grace not only as a gift, but a challenge. The challenge is to go on a spiritual journey, he calls it a desert, of relinquishing our attachments, our idols. And during that journey, we discover the depths of our weakness, the power of grace, and the price of both, until we find our worth that comes from dependence on God. A perfect example of this is when God did not remove Paul's thorn in the flesh, which was a point of humiliation for Paul. Paul walks through the desert of unanswered petitions, hears God's voice saying, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Of course, God doesn't enjoy Paul's humiliation, but offers a grace so empowering that Paul moves from humiliation to humility and a deeper dependence upon God. Next slide, please. Okay. I want to skip, if this is PowerPoint 30, I want this to be skipped, and we will come back to this later in the presentation. So that would be on the Cusick. Yeah, that's where I want it to be. Thank you. I want to ask this. If grace is so amazing, why do we resist it? Let's look at some of the reasons I think about, and I would welcome any thoughts you have about it during our question and answer. Number one, grace is undeserved, unmerited, and levels the playing field. It doesn't make sense. It's unfair and includes people we don't particularly like or even respect. Grace demands a complete paradigm shift. I think those of us who have worked hard, made sacrifices, done the right thing, if honest, we find grace difficult to receive. We have built our identity around achievement and merit. The prodigal son is thrown a party. The laborers who started work at the beginning of the day get the same wage as those who show up with a few minutes left in the day. Grace upends our merit system, and we have been hard baked in that much of our life. I think grace demands a complete shift. Under number 2 and 3, shame's lies are embedded deeply. It takes courage and patience to heal from shame's wounds. That's true. And giving up our attachments, idols, is equally difficult. We cannot do it alone. And that's where I want to talk, is we have been built, especially of those of us growing up in Western cultures, prize our independence, and we've brought that into our spirituality. We need support and assistance along the way. And this is hard for us to admit. But you ask recovered addicts what the secret to recovery is, and they will tell you about their inability to recover on their own. They're dependent upon God, and they rely on a group of other recovering addicts on their way to sobriety. We need to learn from them. So number 4, we feel let down by God and become angry, numb, or detached. I think when we feel, and I underline that word feel, when we feel abandoned by God, we still may hold on to the fact of God's love, but it doesn't feel that way, does it? It's hard to feel the benefits of grace at that moment. We don't feel grace's lightness, its joy and gratitude. I think we need to process our pain with someone who will not give answers to the why, but will help us with our grief and lament. Next slide, please. We have received grace, and I need to change something so I can read this. I'm having a hard time reading number 5. You guys read that. And I'm trying to get, yeah, I can't do it. So we have received grace for the parting of our wrongs, but we have failed to realize how grace is there to restore our worthiness. We've already talked about that, as Lou Smedes makes this point very well. Okay, number 6. when we have been hurt, judged, and condemned and betrayed, when we have been vulnerable to others. And one of the major points in my presentation is that if we are to experience release from shame and enter into grace, we need that embodied to us through people who offer that to us. So if those of us who've experienced that risk of opening ourselves up to each other have ended up worse off for doing so, we've risked the sharing of our shame, and it's only been reinforced by judgment, withdrawal, shunning, even abusive statements. This is a travesty. This is shame's proudest moment. If grace is to be embodied through us, we must make our relationships safe. We must hold confidences. We must hold sacred all the spiritual journeys someone is on without judgment. When someone is vulnerable, we need to receive that vulnerability with vulnerability. So number 7, we realize that salvation is a gift, but then we move so quickly into sanctification, which becomes a form of self-improvement, of a works attainment, a works righteousness. So salvation becomes a gift. We're free from sin, the penalty of sin and the guilt of sin. But then we go about trying hard to imitate Christ, of foul biblical teachings improve spiritually that result in more failure and shame. I want to talk more about this later in the webinar. And then finally, if we only look for evidence of grace in the special occasions, but then we are blind to the graces offered daily, we lose how bountiful God's grace is to us. We don't see it, in fact. We don't so much resist it here as much as we just ignore it. So I want us to take about 7 to 8 minutes here of a break. If you need to get up and stretch, do that pretty quickly, but I'd like you to come back to your chat function and make observations or questions about shame and grace. Be as brief as you can, because there may be a number of people who will be sharing. You may want to share a resource or a practice for healing shame with us as a group. Feel free to do that. But forward your chat questions or your comments to Lisa and Amber. They'll organize your responses, and then I will be able to begin to answer some of them at the end of my presentation. So let's take about 6-7 minutes right now. Thank you.
Just a quick reminder, if you weren't here for this part at the beginning, if you're starting to respond or send questions or comments, as Peter suggested, just so that we can organize things a bit better. If your last name begins with an A, if you're an L, please send them to Amber. If your last name's M through Z, send them on to me. Thanks.
Okay, I want to just give you about a half a minute to finish whatever you're writing and send it off, and we'll begin shortly. So welcome back. And if you can use the chat function if you have questions that come up as we continue our to complete our webinar here. I want us to look now how shame shows up in cross-cultural living. If you would turn, yes, great. I believe those of you who live in these cross-cultural settings face some unique challenges. And here are some of the most common statements we hear. Take a look at them if you would. Notice how we struggle with, am I enough? When we learn a new language, try to find energy for our work, perhaps feel guilty about spending money that feels more connected to us than what may be necessity. Have some anxiety about writing support letters when you feel that you're not doing enough. Next slide, please. Here we see comments coming out of a feeling of spiritual emptiness, struggling with team members who you don't feel safe with, having personal problems that you don't dare talk to anyone about, that have you question your spirituality. Next slide, please. Yeah, if we could back it up once. So in the next slide, there are comments and questions about facing burnout or not having sufficient joy in your cross-cultural living and carrying doubt about even your calling. These are all places that and statements that I have heard, my wife has heard, and other folks here coming from the experiences that you are having. I want you to later come back to these slides and then ask yourself, where's the shame arising in these situations, from within the worker or from others? And what are the messages of shame? And what would it mean to practice shame resilience in each of these situations? I want to add this before moving on. Many of us know how difficult cross-cultural living is. As we try to fulfill our vision and demonstrate our effectiveness, we can allow shame to come in the back door and whisper, even shout, "You are not enough." Yet there can be another layer of difficulty. That is, we can be shamed by team members, leaders in ministry areas, by our supporters, by organizations to which we belong. When this shame goes unhealed or unrecognized, the burdens of living cross-culturally grow even more difficult. And we've heard stories about that in our counseling. The good news is that you can still build shame resilience in the face of this, but you will need to find grace-filled relationships elsewhere. If you would turn to the next slide. So we're about to turn to some practices in healing shame. The next slide would be great, thanks. When you receive my PowerPoint talk after the webinar, you will see that I've offered some suggestions for each of these practices that we won't have time to review. So I will just focus on a few in depth and skip lightly over the rest. So let's turn to the next slide. Let's look at the first 4 practices that we have listed here. You can see that there's an encouragement to look at shame resilience, look at addictions and attachments, develop a story about grace and shame, and so on. All of them encourage you to dig more deeply into your own story, and then you are challenged to share your process with someone else or within a small group. Why that sharing? When we have a chance to rework our stories, looking from where we are now to the past, we can give those stories new meaning and perspective. When we are emotionally vulnerable in sharing our stories with someone who enters into our experience, we have a chance to heal from shame. You can read more about this in Thompson's Anatomy of the Soul, especially pages 65 through 80. And a powerful example of embodied grace can be found on the PowerPoint 30, which is, we don't have to go back to that, but this is where Michael Cusick, the author of Surfing for God, shares a powerful story about an early sexual abuse memory that sent him reeling backwards in time. And he heard God invite him to ask for the presence of a close friend to enter this painful experience. He was sitting in a closet in this really frightened place, and he invites this friend to come in. And as this friend does so, he embodies the grace to Cusick that helps him heal from the shame connected to his childhood abuse memory. Next slide. Let's see. Yes. So developing an embodied theology of shame and grace as you reflect on scripture. I did a little bit of that work earlier in my talk, but books by Thompson and Smedes, Wilkes, or Cousins can be helpful templates. If you have primarily viewed salvation through the lens of guilt and disobedience, what would it mean to view salvation through the lens of shame and shame redeemed? The next one, treat yourself with compassion and acceptance, especially when you fail. Resources by Neff, Oden, and Krager can help here. I challenge you to listen to your inner dialogue during the day, especially when you're struggling. Write down what your thoughts are about yourself. Can you allow Christ's compassion to transform your self-criticism into gentle self-acceptance? This is not a version of feeling good. This is a version of self-acceptance as God sees us and loves us in our element right now. The next one there. So let go of the gap between your ideal self and your actual self. It only increases your shame. The difference between who we are and who we want to be becomes a point of spiritual measurement. We can begin a process of shaming ourselves, believing we are not faithful or spiritually mature or whatever enough. And while God yearns for us to love as completely as he does, his love and acceptance is not affected by our performance. It only seems to impact our view of ourselves. For those of you inclined to be perfectionistic, read the articles out of the Oneing Journal on perfectionism, or read about type 1 on the Enneagram. And also witness to your imperfections using the language of shame and shame redeemed. Our world is in search of authentic and genuine connections. If our witness is to show people how much we need Jesus, then we need to share our failures. I'm quoting someone named Fisher here. You can look in the resources. We need to become vulnerable and speak the language of shame redeemed. Next slide, please. Read authors who understand that the most profound experience of grace often comes through suffering and shame. Books by Yancey, Manning, Nouwen, Rohr, and Falling Upwards come to my mind. You may have many others. Explore how shame uniquely intersects with your Enneagram type. You know, we all experience shame, but we're likely to be triggered differently, depending upon our attachment histories, our traumatic experiences, and by our personality types. If you appreciate the wisdom of the Enneagram, you might want to listen to the podcast in 2020 created by Cron, a co-author of The Road Back to You, who interviews Kurt Thompson on shame and the Enneagram types. Engage Christian contemplative practices that involve being, not doing. And much of our prayer practices have engaged the left hemisphere, the more verbal, structured part of our brain, but we've ignored ancient Christian practices such as centering prayer, breath prayers, the Jesus prayer, welcoming prayer, the prayer of exam, and practicing the presence of God, all of which may be better ground us in our bodies and daily rhythms. Resources are many here, but I include Odin, Berjolt, and Edwards. Observe rest and engage relinquishing practices. Keep the Sabbath. That stops our striving, and it makes us aware of how we need to let go of outcomes as well. Periods of silence and solitude strip us of our normal activities and reveal our attachments and addictive patterns. Fasting practices help do the same. You may want to read May's description of the desert journey in addiction and grace. Next slide, please. As you look at these practices, the common thread through these on this slide is that to not engage your left hemisphere, but right hemisphere as well. Grace needs to be embodied. Absorb scripture through the practice of Lectio Divina and other non-analytic methods. We need to engage our imagination. It's been demonstrated that we have our capacity to retain powerful stories is improved through our imagination. So listening to the stories in scripture about shame and shame redeemed can be very, very powerful, imagining ourselves in that story itself. Engage as many senses as possible to experience grace and shame redeemed. Listen to music that lifts our spirits, help us cry confessionally or with joy. Sing the Psalms, use body posture and movement while praying or meditating. Read books on grace out loud to each other. Watch movies with redemptive themes. Walk in God's creation and marvel at the constant cycles of death and renewal, life out of decay. Develop your capacity for beauty, joy, and gratitude. Everything we create suggests beauty, including when brokenness is restored. Imagine a loving father speaking personally to you through his word daily. And a good example of that is to read the Father's love letter, which many of you may know. It can be found online. Don't forget the ordinary graces, all the way from our own breathing to all the ways we are sustained daily by God. Next slide, please. We need to deepen the practice of confession and forgiveness. as a vital pathway to release shame and restore our intimate connections. When we privately confess to God and receive his forgiveness for our sin and shame, we bypass a powerful way to renew our minds. When my wife Marty and I counsel together, we recommend a comforting confession to couples whose hurts have caused damage in their relationship. And so we suggest to them that a sincere apology is only made after the emotional pain that has been caused by the offender is fully understood. Deep apology requires the ability to empathize with the one who's been hurt. And when that happens, forgiveness and connection can deepen. I also suggest reading James 5:14-16 as an excellent reminder of what can happen in a healthy confessional faith community. And lastly, of these practices, seek spiritual direction or life coaching with someone who can listen to your story of shame and grace. A spiritual director or life coach can help reflect with you what you are discovering about yourself and God. The next slide, please. I also want you to consider these approaches to healing shame. Many people have benefited from healing of memories or other inner healing prayer ministries, and I don't want to omit that. There are many people who report deep healing from that. I also want to encourage you, for those of you who have had trauma or abuse in your background, to pursue counseling, especially with practitioners who are aware of EMDR and other related trauma-based practices. If you're addicted, there's 12-step programs. You might consider, even if you're not suffering in a way, to enter a counseling relationship that will help you review your life. You're letting someone see you, and that is a step towards healthy vulnerability. Next slide, please. There's some closing observations I'd like to make. One is that our faith communities and organizations and churches need to be places of grace so that we can assist in moving out of shame. And I believe that I want to challenge us, the church, as to developing its worship, sacraments, its practices, its disciplines and witness, and create a healing place for shame. How can we practice confession and forgiveness so that the actual healing and repair of shame is embodied? Our world desperately needs to know how to redeem shame. It needs people who know personally and collectively how to deal with their own shame and walk in the likeness of grace. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I want Lisa, because I am blocked from my PowerPoint, Lisa, could you read Lewis Mead's verses that he composed at the end of his book, Shame and Grace? It's entitled A World. Thank you. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm just making sure I have it all. Where unhealthy shame is obsolete, where healthy shame has lost its sting, where we know we are of great worth when we accept the grace we do not deserve, where bad choices of the past do not determine our worth today or forfeit our hope for tomorrow, where we dare to feel guilty when guilty we are, for we know our guilt can be forgiven, where we celebrate our imperfections, where we can feel silly without feeling shame, where grace gives us reason to be proud of ourselves, where the lightness of grace lifts the heaviness of shame, where joy is the whole point.
Thank you, Lisa. If you turn to the next. I just want to say to you, as we've drawn to a close, how much I've appreciated this opportunity. This has been an experience of me trying to overcome the shame of my perfectionism as I've gone through this with you. And I hope that there is something here for you, that God speaks to you about ways that you can overcome your shame through his grace. You'll notice here on the sources that I will have listed a couple more sources that I have not included here since putting this PowerPoint together. So you'll find that in my PowerPoint talk text. So let's open this up to your questions, and I will hope, Lisa and Amber, that I will be able to have them come to me and I can read them out loud and then try to respond.
We'll start sending them to you now, Peter.
Okay.
Do you see that first one?
I don't. Do I hit?
The
I don't see.
chat down at the bottom.
There, it's more like up on the top. All right. Chat. There we go. Okay. I gave you a start, didn't I, Lisa? Okay. I don't see the first one. Oh, can you say more about shame on the preverbal toddler? How to avoid while correcting? That's a great question. And first of all, let me just point to some sources. I believe that there is a section in Brene Brown's Daring Greatly that talks a lengthy chapter about raising parenting without shame, trying to be non-shame based. And I know that Kurt Thompson also does that, I believe, either in The Soul of Shame or in The Anatomy of the Soul. He tries to bring some answer to this discussion. I think that being that I don't consider myself to be a child psychologist, but having worked with children, so much of what we communicate to our children of whatever age is our nonverbals. It's what we embody. Of course, we can avoid shaming messages. We can speak to their actions and not to their character. But it's in our tone, isn't it? It's in how hard we come on at a toddler, setting limits without overreacting, staying calm while addressing behavior that we want to change. That is, I think, really what we're communicating when we communicate shame to our children, is through our bodies and how we react. So I think the very first step is, what do we do with our own reactions, our own frustrations, and breathe, relax, sort through what's important to us as we go ahead and parent our children? That's a great question. Another question: how do you begin to create an environment where people can be vulnerable when people are scared, believe that if they are vulnerable, it will be used against them? This has been a question that I have wrestled with all through this preparation of this presentation, because this is where the action is creating a place where being vulnerable is safe. And I gave it some thought as to whether I should even get into this area, but I believe that it deserves probably another whole presentation about what that requires. I feel that, especially, that if there aren't people who don't understand confidentiality, and what I mean by that is keeping whatever is said in this room stays in this room. Whatever that means for a group of people or just in a one-to-one. Coming as a professional, I understand that the absolute necessity of confidentiality. And also then, how do we enter into experiences with people who are frightened about whether we're going to turn away? And that doesn't mean just leaving the room or things we say. Sometimes our silence and our averting our eyes, all kind of nonverbal messages that suggest that what we're hearing is unacceptable. So we have to really we have to work on our non-judgmentalism. We have to really try to be empathic and enter into the experience of someone else, trying not to judge what we're hearing and the reactions to what we're hearing. We sit as comfortably as we can with them. And that is hard to do. I think we all are built to make judgments, and we're quick to give advice or even fix. And people who are opening up to us need the safety of just someone coming alongside and listening absolutely non-judgmentally. But it's a great question. I would love to have someone talk about organizations becoming safe, teams becoming safe, and what that would look like. But we definitely have to have relationships that look this way for us. Another question, drawing attention to shame appears to exacerbate it. When encountering low-level shame in conversation or interactions, what are simple ways to disarm it? Wow. All right. Great question. There is a way, isn't it? I would call this, you're talking about public embarrassment. It's almost as if what you're saying is when shame comes up or you experience it or it comes from someone else, to address it directly could only increase it, right? I think this is what the questioner is asking. And sometimes the disarming, if we can disarm embarrassment, we can enter into it with, we can frame it with a softness or a gentleness. We can go all the way from ignoring it to chuckling about it, depending on who we are. We have to be careful with humor that it isn't viewed as sarcasm or making things worse. But I think sometimes ignoring something that is of minor embarrassment sometimes is the best way to handle embarrassment. When we're talking about toxic shame that goes much deeper than that, then I think we talk about how do we make that safe for someone. But in our social interactions, I think sometimes a sense of humor, ignoring, or saying, I know what you're going through right now. I've been through that too. I've done that myself. Some disarming ways to do that. What's the next question? Can I touch on shame and sexual abuse, since you didn't get it back to it in the PowerPoint? You know, I think that my presentation was purposely made for a general group of people. Although I mentioned shame and abuse and that shame underlies much of abuse, I didn't really get into that, and purposely so. I will say to you this about whether it's sexual abuse or any form of abuse, physical, verbal, emotional abuse. If we have suffered from those incidents or incidents over time, I would suggest that we get into some professional counseling. We need the absolute confidentiality of that. We need some expertise in a counselor coming alongside using, say, EMDR or other approaches. There's some specialty and there's some technique involved in getting at some of the pain and the unexpressed shame messages underlying abuse incidents. And that's not always easily gotten to. It has to be carefully done. So that's another talk, how to do that. And so Next question. Can you say more about what a healthy dynamic of shame is like? How is it different from guilt? And how it helps me seek grace when I need it? Great question. To me, when I review what healthy shame would look like, I don't know if it's that much different from guilt. Guilt is about wrongdoing, right? And I can be ashamed of something I've said or done without it being wrong, correct? If you're following me. So a corrective action around, if I felt some healthy shame come up in me for something, some social miscue or something I've said or done, I can go to that person and say, hey, I apologize for how I may have embarrassed you or embarrassed myself when. And we're really doing something similar as if we've been, we feel guilt and we come and approach somebody for what we've done. But we're really not admitting to guilt as much as we're admitting to a kind of a healthy shame. We went past perhaps a social propriety at that moment. So that, to me, that's how I view the healthy dynamic of shame. Um, and it does overlap significantly with how we deal with guilt. Another question? The question is, which idols do we typically cling to avoid the feelings of shame in ourselves? Well, if you go to May's Shame and Addiction, or Addiction and Grace and Addiction book, when you get through his second chapter, when he lists off all of our addictive behaviors, you realize there's no one who's going to escape realizing that all the way from TV, too much TV watching, to ways that we end up escaping into even typical pleasures can become idols or attachments. His point is that the desire itself is not wrong, nor are the objects of desire wrong, but it's in our clinging to them. It's in our giving them too much power over our life. So, I mean, um, to name the idols is not the point as much as to name how we allow things that even give us pleasure to have a hold on us. It's tricky. I would encourage you, whoever asked that question, to take a look at Gerald May's discussion on that. I think it's chapter 2 of his Grace and Addiction, just what he means by that clinging to avoiding things. We avoid taking care of ourselves. We avoid moving towards those we love. We avoid spending time with God, just enjoying his fellowship as we cling to things that give us pleasure. And I think our life shouldn't be filled with guilt, like, oh, I should be doing this versus that. It's not May nor I am suggesting more guilt. It's just realizing how much we use our attachments to do some avoiding of self-care, caring for others, and engaging God. How have you seen a lack of dealing with shame play out badly in the lives of cross-cultural workers? I have to be careful here because at Olive Tree and other places I've counseled, I've heard some really painful stories, and so I am not going to share the specifics of them. But I will say to you that the worst examples are folks who have been forced to leave the field because of some of the inability that has had the inability to resolve conflict between cross-cultural workers and other members of their team or leaders in the organization. As I've listened to their stories, I think that there's been a failure in the relationship as well as whatever failure the client that's telling me that story is responsible for. And I also have experienced stories from cross-cultural workers that involve actually verbal and emotional abuse is what I would call it, um, where someone has opened up their pain and they've been essentially told that they need to repent, they need to do something different, what they've shared is unacceptable, and there's a kind of a judgment that's been brought in, and it has hurt the cross-cultural worker badly. It's even if they don't leave the field, they feel a kind of injury that has now shut them off from a loving connection with maybe teammates or other leaders in their organization. I've heard stories of supporters who ask the questions about how effective are you being out there? Why aren't you doing more? Tell me about the numbers, and end up shaming a worker who's in a very difficult uh, field. And back home, people are expecting results. So I mean, these are all places of pain. These are the stories I've heard. Any other questions? And Lisa, I know that it's nearing 8:30 your time, right? And I'm happy to keep going if people want to. If people are leaving and want to leave, I understand that. But I'd be happy to keep answering questions. Would you consider doing another webinar on how to sit with someone in a healthy, non-judgmental way? Um, uh, Uh, sure, I would consider that, but I would also love to offer any of the staff members at Olive Tree to do this one. Uh, you know, I will tell you, as I was doing this webinar, I realized over and over that the way out of shame is to become not professional therapists, but to become therapeutic in a relationship. Uh, I am not suggesting that everyone has to sign up for a graduate program in counseling. I have seen very effective non-degreed people offer grace and are sensitive to the person's space and just know what to do. And these people can also teach and model about healthy non-judgmentalism. But I do think that we mental health professionals who do this on a daily basis could teach this. Maybe what we need to do is to look at ways that we can teach this in different organizations, churches, and in groups. Other questions?
Sorry, Peter, I'm wrangling. I'll just, maybe we can wrap up with this last one. I think it's a
Okay.
good kind of overall one. The idea of somebody suggested that shame is really good at disguising itself, as you've suggested. How do you go about identifying it for what it is if you're new to this or you're not sure what that feeling is like?
Yeah. See, that's a great question. And this may not be satisfying to the questioner, but let me just talk about myself. I've been a perfectionist. I became aware of my perfectionism in my early 20s. I'm now age 71. 50 years later, I'm still struggling with it, okay? But along the way, I began to realize some things. I began to realize that when I overworked and that I began to become critical of myself, I realized that I used that as a way to withdraw from people. The consequences of my perfectionism began to have impact on my relationships. I also began to realize that um, rarely did I feel like I celebrated my accomplishments. I would hit the summit every once in a while, feel good about what I did, but nothing counted about my past. I couldn't live with the knowledge or the trust that the next thing I do would be good enough. And even the word good enough, even now, I have to admit, feels like for a perfectionist, good enough feels like getting a C when you should have gotten an A. You know, I grew up in a family environment that if you could get an A, well, do your best, get an A. So anything below an A meant I was a failure, right? So I've lived with this all my life. I began to see what it was doing to my soul, to my emotions, how it began to affect my relationships. And when I was under the gun, and in my career, I had to put reports together that was going to be reviewed by others. I felt it deeply until I got to the point, and I went into some therapy for myself, until I got to that place where I began to realize the sources of that perfectionism, where the shaming occurred. I went back into my childhood memories. And both I've had experiences where I've not been, by anyone's measure, profoundly abused, but I had a perfectionistic father. I had a mom who had high ideals about being a Christian and a certain kind of morality around that. So I had to go deep in my own exploration to realize that shame was where I had to go to finally begin to feel the deeper relief. I say that all of us have different behavioral patterns. Some of us are not driven like I am. But if you go back through the layers of your life, you can discover, perhaps with talking with someone or just your own careful way of going back. You can go to Brene Brown, who does some of the shame resilience work. You can go to Kurt Thompson's Anatomy of the Soul. He does some wonderful suggestions there about how to do an autobiography and going back into yourself to explore where those sources of shame are. I believe this, that shame is the core emotion. Maybe I'll say it this way. Shame and fear are our basic core emotions. If we're struggling, if we're trying to be good enough, if we don't feel enough, that's likely to be shame, right? If we're afraid to risk, that could come out of shame, but there are things that we fear. And I think that those two emotions, fear and shame, are really what Jesus came into our world about. I mean, he really wanted to say, there is no place that I can't go where shame exists. And there is no place that you need to be afraid. So much scripture is about being not afraid. And Jesus wanted our shame to be lifted. I really think the primary message, yes, there's sin and there's guilt and we're forgiven. But the predominant story, I think, in scripture is about shame and shame redeemed. And I think the church needs to grab that and deepen that and become more effective at being a place for people who long to be released from shame.